The notice had said cook wanted, ranch of 30 hands, urgent, and Susanna Calloway had walked the last 6 miles to the Rimfire spread on blistered feet, because urgent was the only word in it that mattered to a woman with $11, a false name half formed on her tongue, and a county sheriff 2 towns back who believed she had stolen $400 from the mercantile she'd clerked for. She had not stolen it. She knew that with a certainty that did her no good at all against a ledger some other hand had falsified, and a shop owner's nephew who swore, straight-faced, that he'd seen her pocket the bills himself. She had clerked at Whitcomb's Mercantile 3 years, ever since her father's death had left her with a widowed mother to support and no other trade to turn to, and she had kept those books with a care she took genuine pride in, balancing every column twice before she'd let herself sleep at night. That pride, it turned out, had done her no good at all when the nephew, a young man named Del Whitcomb who fancied himself owed the position she held, had gone looking for a way to clear her out and make room for a cousin of his own choosing. She had run because the alternative was a trial in a town where the accuser's family owned the judge's mortgage, and because running, however it shamed her, at least left her a chance at proving the truth later, from somewhere safer than a jail cell. She had left her mother with what little money she could spare, and a promise to send for her once the matter was settled, and the guilt of that parting sat in her chest still, a stone she carried everywhere she walked. Holly's train found her sitting on the corral fence when he rode in from the north pasture, a thin, travel-worn woman with careful eyes and a carpetbag that looked like it hadn't held much of anything for a long while, and he knew before she said a word that whatever had brought her to his ranch, it wasn't an easy story. "You're here about the cook posting," he said, dismounting. "I am if it's still open. I can cook for 30 same as 3, Mr. Train, and I don't eat much and I don't complain." She stood, squaring her shoulders in a way he found he respected before he'd even decided to. "I ought to tell you plain, though, since you'll hear it eventually if you haven't already. There's a warrant out on me 2 counties east. I didn't do what they say I did, but I understand if that's reason enough for you to send me on." Holly's considered her a long moment. This ranch that had run through 2 cooks in as many months and left his 30 hands eating burnt beans and worse tempers, and considered, too, the particular steadiness in her voice. A woman telling him the worst of herself before he could hear it twisted from someone else's mouth first. "What they say you did." "Stole $400 from my employer. I clerked his mercantile 3 years, kept his books honest the whole while, and the 1 month the real thief helped himself, I was the convenient woman to blame, on account of his nephew wanting my position for a cousin of his own and having the connections to make the lie stick." She met his eyes. "I know how that sounds. I know a claim of innocence is cheap, and every guilty soul in the territory makes the same one. Ranch is going to starve without a cook regardless of what's true or false 2 counties east," Holly said finally. "I need someone in that kitchen by supper, and near as I can tell, you're the only someone who's answered in 3 weeks." He turned toward the house before she could read too much into his decision. "Wages are 20 a month and board, kitchen's through the back." She stood a moment, stunned by how simply he'd said it before hurrying after him, and did not yet let herself trust that a man could hand a fugitive a job and a roof so plainly, without a single further question asked. Holly's train had run cattle at Rimfire 11 years, since his father's death had put the whole operation in his hands at 23, and in that time he had learned that a man's word and a woman's word carried the exact same weight in his estimation, which was to say, whatever weight the person speaking had earned by their conduct, and none whatsoever assigned automatically on account of a badge or a title or a family name behind the accusation. He had watched enough crooked business get done in this territory by men with clean reputations and dirty hands to know that a warrant proved a great deal less than most folks assumed it did. He did not tell her that, not directly, not in the first weeks. He only watched her work, watched her run his kitchen with a quiet, exacting competence that had his hands eating better within a fortnight than they had in a year, watched her patience with old Dutch Coombs's grumbling and her gentleness with the youngest hand, a boy of 16 homesick for his mother's cooking, and found that, whatever the truth of the warrant, the woman standing in front of him now was not one he could easily picture stealing from anyone. She kept the Rimfire accounts, too. Once Holly's discovered by accident that she had a clerk's neat hand and a quick head for figures, entries logged so precisely that his own bookkeeping, sloppy and infrequent since his father's death, suddenly looked like the work of a careless boy beside hers. He would find her some evenings bent over the ledger by lamplight long after the last hand had gone to bunk, double-checking a column she'd already checked twice, and understood, watching her, that whatever else the warrant claimed of her, this was not a woman who treated other people's money carelessly. It was, if anything, the opposite fault she carried, a woman so scrupulously honest that the accusation against her must have struck her, he imagined, like a blow to something she held sacred about her own character. The hands took to her quick, too, in the unhurried way ranch crews generally came around to a good cook, first through their stomachs and then, without quite noticing the shift, through something warmer than mere appetite. Dutch Coombs, the oldest and crankiest of the lot, declared within a month that he hadn't eaten so well since his own mother's table, and young Petey Marsh, homesick and 16, took to lingering in the kitchen doorway after supper just to hear Susanna ask after his day, something no one else on the ranch thought to do. "You've got a fine hand with a biscuit, Miss Calloway," he told her one evening, lingering in the kitchen doorway after the hands had cleared out, "and a finer one with Dutch, who I've not once in 6 years heard go a full supper without complaining about something." "Dutch complains because he likes the attention it gets him," Susanna said, not looking up from the dough she was working. "Give a lonely old man someone who will argue back kindly instead of ignoring him, and he'll follow you around like a pup, warrant or no warrant." Holly's laughed, surprised into it, and Susanna looked up at the sound, something in her own face softening to hear it. "You don't ask me about it," she said. "The warrant, most men would have had a dozen questions by now." "Figured you'd tell me what you wanted told, in your own time," Holly said. "Man who demands the whole of a woman's hardest story before he's earned the trust to hear it proper isn't owed the telling anyhow." She studied him a long moment in the lamplight, this rancher who had hired a fugitive on nothing but her own word and a shortage of cooks, and felt something in her chest that she recognized, uneasily, as the early workings of trust she had not expected to feel again for a good long while. It was 6 weeks into her employment that trouble came riding up the Rimfire road in the shape of a hired man named Purdy, sent by the mercantile owner's nephew with a description and a reward poster both. And Susanna, catching sight of him from the kitchen window, felt her whole careful new life go cold and small around her in an instant. She did not run. She had run once already and it had cost her nearly everything. She found, standing at the window with her hands trembling on the sill, that she did not have it in her to run again, and that whatever came of Purdy's arrival, she would rather face it standing in the kitchen she'd come to think of, foolishly perhaps, as something like home. Holly's met Purdy in the yard before the man's boots had even cleared his stirrup. "Looking for a woman," Purdy said, holding up the poster. "Goes by Susanna Calloway, wanted for theft over in Millbrook County. Word is she's working this ranch." "She's my cook," Holly said, "and she's told me the whole of that story herself, first day she walked onto this land, before I'd even offered her the position. Seems to me a guilty woman generally doesn't lead with her own worst evidence." "Rewards $50, brought in alive for trial." $50, Holly's repeated. "For a woman I've watched keep honest accounts of every sack of flour and side of beef that's come through my kitchen these 6 weeks, down to the penny, same care she's accused of not taking with someone else's ledger 2 counties off. Man who's actually stealing don't generally keep books that clean where somebody's watching." Purdy's jaw worked. "That ain't your call to make train, warrant's a warrant." "And a warrant built on a nephew's testimony and a ledger nobody, but that nephew's had hands on, is worth exactly as much as I say it's worth on my own land, which is precious little." Holly's voice stayed even, but there was iron under it now that had not been there a moment before. "You want to haul her off my property against her word and mine both. You'll do it with the sheriff present and a judge willing to look at both ledgers side by side, not on the strength of a poster and a bounty. Otherwise, you can turn that horse around." Susanna had come out onto the porch by then, and she stood with her chin lifted, refusing to hide behind the doorframe the way fear urged her to, though her heart hammered so hard she felt certain both men must hear it. 6 weeks of feeling almost safe had softened something in her. She realized now, watching Purdy's poster flutter in the wind, and the fear that flooded back in at the sight of it was worse for having been briefly forgotten. "I'll go to trial," she said before Purdy could answer Holly's. "I've said as much from the start. I only ask it be a fair one with both ledgers examined by somebody who isn't beholden to the man accusing me. I ran because I was afraid, Mr. Purdy, not because I was guilty, and I'm done running now. If the law wants to look at the truth honestly, I'll stand for it." Purdy looked between the two of them, the rancher immovable in the yard and the woman steady on the porch, and something in his own hard face flickered. A man paid to fetch a fugitive finding instead 2 people who did not behave like anyone he'd ever hauled in guilty. "I ain't paid to judge it," he said finally. "Only paid to bring word back of what I find." "Then bring back word," Holly said, "that she's willing to stand trial fair and square, provided it's fair, and that I'll vouch for her character and pay for an independent accounting myself. Man ought to at least be able to say that much for the woman keeping his books honest 6 weeks running." It took the better part of 2 more weeks, and a trip Holly's made himself at his own expense to fetch an independent accountant from the territorial capital. But the truth, once a disinterested eye was finally allowed to examine both the mercantile's books and the testimony against her, proved exactly as plain as Susanna had always claimed. The ledger entries used to accuse her had been altered after the fact, in a hand that matched, once compared, the very nephew who'd sworn to seeing her guilt with his own eyes, a young man who had needed the position filled by his cousin badly enough to manufacture the theft himself and let Susanna carry the blame. The trial, when it finally came, lasted less than a single afternoon once the independent accountant laid both ledgers side by side before the judge and pointed out, plainly, the places where Del Whitcomb's own hand had altered figures after the fact, careless in his haste in a way Susanna's careful bookkeeping never once had been. Susanna sat through it with her hands folded tight in her lap and Holly's beside her the entire time, having ridden the 2 counties over and sat through every tedious hour of testimony rather than let her face it alone. And when the judge finally pronounced the charges baseless and ordered Del Whitcomb himself held over for fraud, she found she could not immediately stand, her legs gone weak with a relief so total it left her briefly unable to do anything but weep. The charges were dropped that same week, the true thief held for his own reckoning in her place, and Susanna Calloway stood in the Rimfire kitchen some days later with the letter confirming it trembling in her hands, and found Holly's train watching her from the doorway with an expression she had come, over these long, uncertain weeks, to recognize and to treasure. "You believed me," she said, "from the very first day, before there was a single fact to prove it by." "Believed the woman standing in front of me," Holly said, "same as I'd have judged any hand who walked onto this ranch, by what I saw of her conduct, not by what a piece of paper said about her from 2 counties off. Turned out my judgment served us both well enough." "Us both," Susanna repeated softly. "I've grown fond of my cook, Miss Calloway, fonder than strictly proper for an employer, if I'm honest about it. Fond enough that I'd like to ask you to stay on at Rimfire in a considerably more permanent capacity than cook, if you'd have me." She crossed the kitchen to him, the warrant behind her at last, her name clean for the first time in months, and found that whatever she had lost fleeing Millbrook County, she had found something at Rimfire worth every mile of that hard, frightened walk. "I'd have you Holly's train," she said, "warrant or none, and gladly.